There are moments when a single gunshot changes the world forever. That morning, the dusty main street of Willow Creek was just another vein of brown earth cutting through a town that had seen too many broken hearts. But as the sun crawled higher and the air turned sharp with tension, chaos erupted with a volley of gunfire that sent townsfolk scattering like startled quail. And when the dust began to settle, Lily found herself kneeling in the dirt, clutching her dying husband as the world spun out of control. Blood soaked through her fingers, hot and sticky, mingling with the grime of the street. Lily could hardly hear the shouts and screams echoing around her. So focused was she on her husband's face, his eyes already distant, voice a ragged whisper slipping away. She begged him to stay, but his hand grew colder, his grip weaker, until he went still in her arms, and the world seemed to collapse in on itself. The crowd began to gather, shopkeepers with aprons still tied, ranch hands with dust on their boots, mothers pulling children back from the scene. Every face wore a mask of shock or fear, but underneath, Lily caught the sharp glint of suspicion, and worse, the morbid curiosity of people who had always resented the newcomer with the steady hand and honest eyes. It wasn't long before the sheriff arrived, swaggering through the crowd with his men, boots thudding heavy on the boardwalk. The gold badge on his vest gleamed in the sun, but his eyes were colder than the grave. His deputies flanked him, faces Lily knew well enough to mistrust, one with a jagged scar above his brow, the other with a smile too quick and easy for a day like this. They made a show of investigating, but Lily saw how their eyes skimmed over her husband's body, how they barely looked at the ground where blood still pooled, already starting to dry in the heat. The sheriff turned to the gathering crowd and declared, with the authority of a judge handing down a sentence, that this was the work of a stranger, a drifter passing through town with nothing to lose and no one to answer to. "We'll find him," he promised, but his tone carried the dull finality of a man closing a door, not opening one. But Lily saw what the others missed. She saw the way the sheriff's eyes lingered not on her husband's face, but on the empty spot where his badge should have gleamed. She noticed, too, an unfamiliar bullet casing in the dust, its brass catching the sun in a way that seemed almost deliberate, left behind not by accident, but by design. And she saw how quickly the sheriff and his men shuffled the townsfolk away, how eager they seemed to move on, to erase what had just happened. That night, the small house felt impossibly empty. Shadows pressed in around Lily as she washed the blood from her hands and tried to steady her breath. The walls, once filled with laughter and quiet comfort, seemed to close in, suffocating her with memories she could hardly bear to face. Grief pressed down like a weight, crushing her chest, threatening to break her in two. But somewhere in the dark, something began to change. The sorrow, deep and choking, slowly gave way to anger, hot and bright and alive. Lily lit a single candle, its flame quivering against the night, and sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded tight. She remembered the look in the sheriff's eyes, the way the badge was missing, the strange bullet. She remembered, too, the coldness in the voices around her, the quickness with which people looked away, as if they already knew how this story was meant to end. She reached for her husband's old Bible, its leather cover worn soft from years of use, and laid it open in front of her. With her voice trembling but steady, she spoke aloud, not to God, but to the man she had lost, and to the darkness that now threatened to swallow her. "I will find out who did this. I will not let your death be buried with the truth. I swear it." The wind rattled the windows. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped and snorted in the dark. Lily could not sleep, not with her mind running in circles, replaying every detail of the day, searching for a clue she might have missed. She remembered the last words her husband had spoken to her, words she had hardly noticed at the time. "Trust your eyes, Lily, not your ears." She got up and walked through the house, every room heavy with his absence. On the table by the front door, she found his hat, still bearing the dust of the trail, and next to it, the holster that should have held his badge. But the badge was gone. Taken, she now realized, not by a stranger, but by someone who needed it, hidden. And the bullet casing she had spotted in the street. It was unlike the rounds her husband carried, larger, more expensive, like the kind favored by the town's wealthier men. As dawn crept through the window, Lily realized she would never be the same. The woman who had come to Willow Creek for a new beginning was gone. In her place stood a widow burning with purpose, her grief hardening into resolve. The first suspicion had taken root, deep and bitter. And though she was alone, widowed, whispered about, already marked by tragedy, she would not be intimidated or chased away. Not until she had uncovered every secret, no matter how many powerful men wanted them kept. The candle guttered out, leaving her in darkness. But inside, a fire had been lit. Lily was no longer just a grieving wife. She was a woman with a vow. Mourning brought no peace. The funeral came far too soon, pressed by the urgency of men who had no time for a widow's grief. The undertaker arrived before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, his face pinched and businesslike, refusing to meet Lily's eyes as he handed her a threadbare black shawl. There was no music, no flowers, just the measured thud of shovels and the muttered prayers of a preacher who seemed more eager to finish than to comfort. The townsfolk gathered only out of obligation, faces closed and wary, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid even a funeral could draw suspicion. Most kept their distance. A few whispered condolences, but their words felt hollow, perfunctory, like lines in a play everyone wished would end. More than one rancher made a point of lingering near Lily, but their concern was mixed with calculation. Their eyes were on her land, not her loss. After the burial, as she turned to leave, the real message of the day arrived. One by one, the town's power players sidled up to her, Mr. Cormack, whose sprawling ranch bordered her own, the owner of the general store, the preacher, even the banker's thin-lipped wife, each in their own way, with gentle words and sharp smiles, pressed her to sell her small piece of land and leave Willow Creek behind. "It would be best," one murmured. "No shame in starting over somewhere else," said another. Their offers glistened with false kindness, but underneath, Lily felt the steel. Leave or be swallowed whole. That evening, back in the suffocating quiet of her home, Lily pressed her forehead to the window pane and watched as a pair of strangers rode slow circles near her fence. It was a show of power, just enough to remind her that she was being watched. Her every move catalogued by men who considered themselves above consequence. The sky outside burned with the red light of sunset, but inside, shadows pooled, growing longer and thicker with every passing hour. Exhausted but restless, Lily began the slow, methodical task of sorting through her husband's things, determined to find something, anything, that might explain the chaos that had shattered her world. She rifled through his desk, checked his coat pockets, pulled out drawers she had never bothered to open before. And there, tucked behind a stack of receipts and a coil of fence wire, she found a small slip of folded paper, yellowed and fragile at the edges. She recognized her husband's handwriting instantly. Bold, looping script, more certain than she felt. The note was short. If anything happens, trust no one in the sheriff's office. They're all in it. J. Her breath caught in her throat as she read it again and again. The words glowed like coals in the darkness, lighting up 1,000 little moments she had overlooked. A look here, a muttered warning there. Everything started to shift, the pieces snapping into place with terrible clarity. Her husband had known he was a marked man. He had tried to warn her, even as he played his part, keeping the peace in a town rotting from the inside. Fury mingled with fear, but underneath, a new resolve took hold. She would not run. She would not give these men the satisfaction of scaring her away from the only home she had left. The next morning, sleep-starved and hollow-eyed, Lily pulled on her best dress and marched to the sheriff's office. The front of the building was always swept and tidy, the sign above the door freshly painted. But inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the stench of cheap whiskey. The sheriff sat behind his desk, boots up, eyes cold and bored. The deputy lounged nearby, cleaning his nails with a bowie knife, watching her with the slow smile of a coyote circling wounded prey. Lily demanded answers. Why her husband's badge was missing. Why the investigation had ended before it began. Why the townsfolk whispered about strangers when the real threat seemed so much closer to home. The sheriff shrugged, waved off her questions, said something about not getting herself worked up, but his gaze hardened when she mentioned the badge. The deputy's hand tightened on the knife, eyes narrowing just enough for Lily to see the threat behind his casual posture. Dismissed and unwelcome, Lily stepped back onto the street, her anger simmering. The door swung shut behind her with a finality that felt almost deliberate, like the slamming of a cell. She turned and found the townsfolk watching her from behind curtains and storefront windows, their faces half hidden, their judgment unmistakable. She was no longer just a widow. She was now a woman to be feared, or worse, a woman to be destroyed. On her walk home, a group of ranch hands lingered at the crossroads, spitting tobacco and making comments just loud enough to sting. Shoulda left when she had the chance. Ain't safe for a woman alone out here. The message was clear. This town had closed its ranks, and she was now on the outside, left to fend for herself against a storm of whispers and thinly veiled threats. But Lily had made her vow. She returned to her home and bolted the door behind her, the note from her husband clutched in her fist. She knew now that she could trust no one. Not the sheriff, not his deputy, not even the neighbors she once called friends. If she wanted the truth, she would have to find it herself, step by step, clue by clue, no matter how many nights she spent alone in the dark. And so, with the wind howling outside and the memory of her husband's voice still echoing in her mind, Lily steeled herself for the fight ahead. She would not be chased away, would not be broken. The town could turn against her, but she would not run. She would face whatever shadows gathered on her doorstep, and she would not rest until the truth, however ugly, came to light. Days bled into one another in a haze of suspicion and solitude. Each morning, Lily braced herself for what new hardship might come. Another threatening note slipped under her door, a fresh set of muddy boot prints trampled across her front porch, or the unnerving silence of neighbors who once greeted her with warm smiles but now turned away as if she carried a sickness. The town's pressure grew heavier, a silent weight that pressed on her chest every time she stepped outside. Yet she held her ground, moving through routines that had become ritual, tending the garden, repairing fences, feeding the horses, anything to remind herself that she was still alive, still fighting. One afternoon, as she gathered eggs from the coop, a shadow moved along the fence line. Lily's heart leapt. She stood perfectly still, hand tightening around the basket, every muscle alert. Out in the distance, someone approached on horseback. The rider moved with the easy confidence of a man familiar with danger, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the sky, gray hair poking from beneath a battered hat. As he dismounted, his limp became visible, a souvenir from another life, another war. The townsfolk called him Sam, though most had forgotten his last name. They remembered only that he'd returned from the Civil War meaner and quieter than when he'd left, carrying with him more secrets than stories. Lily's first instinct was to turn him away. Trust was a rare and dangerous currency, but Sam's eyes, sharp and unflinching, studied her with something like understanding. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You look like hell," he muttered, voice gravelly from years of whiskey and hard living. "But you ain't beaten." For a moment, the tension between them hung in the air, thick and uncertain. Sam knelt beside the fence, pulling a battered flask from his coat. He poured a measure onto the dry earth, a silent gesture of respect for the man Lily had buried days earlier. Then, just as quietly, he began to talk, not about the weather or the price of cattle, but about the town and its secrets. Sam told her what others refused to say aloud, that her husband had been digging into things best left alone, chasing rumors of bribes and backroom deals that tied the sheriff's office to the wealthiest men in the valley. Her husband had confided in Sam once, sharing his fears that something rotten was festering beneath Willow Creek's sun-bleached surface. Sam knew more than he let on. He'd seen the pattern before in the army, men in power growing fat on fear and silence, using law and badge to cover up their crimes. Lily's skepticism bristled at first. Too many had tried to sway her, to push her from one side of the fence to the other. But Sam's loyalty was different. He spoke in clipped, measured words, never offering false hope, never minimizing the danger. He didn't sugarcoat the risk, admitting that he himself had unfinished business with the sheriff's men. Once they'd tried to run him out of town, breaking his ribs and leaving him for dead in the alley behind the saloon. But Sam had survived, his hatred for the sheriff's circle growing colder and more focused with each passing year. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the ranch in long golden shadows, Lily weighed her choices. She could go on alone, walking a path that grew darker and more dangerous with every step, or she could trust Sam, at least enough to learn what he knew. Her instincts, sharpened by loss and grief, told her that Sam was not a man to cross, but neither was he a man to betray a promise. He wanted justice as much as she did, and perhaps, deep down, he needed redemption too. Sam's knowledge of the town was uncanny. He could name every deputy who owed the sheriff money, every ranch hand who took bribes to look the other way, every gambler and drunk who'd whispered too much after midnight. He'd spent years watching, waiting, gathering scraps of information, like a fox circling a chicken coop, patient but hungry for the right moment to strike. He laid out his findings with a soldier's precision, careful, organized, never giving away more than Lily needed to hear. In the days that followed, their uneasy alliance took shape. Sam brought her scraps of gossip overheard in the saloon, pages torn from account books, names whispered in the darkness. Lily, in turn, offered a place for him at her table and shared what she knew, every odd detail, every look or gesture she'd observed from the sheriff's men, every memory that now felt suspicious. Together, they began piecing together the puzzle, slowly mapping the web of corruption that strangled Willow Creek. The threat remained ever present. One night, a rock shattered her kitchen window. Another time, she found the barn door swinging open, horses scattered, a warning carved into the wood: leave or die. Fear crept in, but Sam never wavered. "They're scared," he said, voice flat. "That means we're getting close." The alliance was forged not from friendship, but from shared purpose and mutual loss. Lily's anger, once raw and unfocused, grew sharper under Sam's guidance. She was no longer just a widow fighting for answers. She was a woman gathering weapons for war, and Sam, for all his scars and secrets, was the best weapon she had. The world outside her ranch remained hostile, but inside, hope flickered. A fragile, stubborn thing. With Sam at her side, Lily knew she would not fall quietly. Together, they would hunt for truth, no matter how many shadows they had to cross, or how many enemies they had to face in the dark. A sharp wind swept through Willow Creek as Lily and Sam began their hunt in earnest. Each day, the air seemed charged with suspicion, as if the whole town could sense the lines shifting beneath the surface. Sam's connections in the back rooms and alleys proved invaluable. He had a way of moving unnoticed, blending in with the shadows, returning each night with fresh fragments of information that Lily carefully stitched together. The tension in the town thickened as rumors spread. A widow asking too many questions, a veteran sniffing around old wounds, both ignoring the silent warnings that would have sent most folks running. The search for answers led them to the saloon, a gaudy, noisy place where secrets sometimes spilled with the whiskey. Inside, the smell of stale beer and sweat clung to the walls, and every pair of eyes seemed to narrow as Lily and Sam stepped through the doors. The bartender, a wiry man with nervous hands, wiped down glasses as they approached, his glance darting to the scarred deputy who nursed a drink at the far end of the bar. Sam leaned in, murmuring questions, his voice low and steady. It didn't take long for the bartender's composure to crack. He remembered the night of the shooting, recalled how the deputy had lingered near the back room, jumpy and pale, vanishing just before the gunfire started. With careful prodding, Lily learned something else. The bartender, spooked by what he'd seen, had stumbled on her husband's missing badge wedged behind a whiskey barrel. Too frightened to turn it over to the sheriff, he'd hidden it away, guarding the secret as if it were a curse. When Sam pressed him to speak up, the bartender's eyes darted to the front door and then back to the deputy at the bar, shaking his head in silent refusal. Fear had its claws in him, and no amount of pleading could pry them loose. Leaving the saloon, Lily felt the weight of eyes on her back. Word traveled fast in Willow Creek, faster than the river after a storm. Whispers curled through the streets. The widow was digging up old bones, poking her nose where it didn't belong. By the next morning, Lily was no longer just an object of pity or suspicion. She was a problem, and problems in this town had a way of disappearing. Small, ugly signs of hostility began to surface. Shopkeepers refused to serve her, closing up their stalls when she passed. Her neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, murmuring prayers or curses under their breath. Even the preacher, who'd once praised her husband's honesty, now kept his distance, eyes hooded and cold. Children who used to play in her yard were pulled away by anxious mothers, as if Lily's very presence was a threat. Sam tried to brush off the town's reaction, but she could see his jaw tightening, his gaze sharpening each time another door slammed in their faces. He took to carrying a shotgun wherever they went, muttering that the enemy was getting nervous, proof that they were closing in on something big. Together they retreated to her ranch at night, poring over notes and whispered clues, building a fragile case in a world that no longer wanted to hear the truth. Then, late one evening, as the last light faded and a hush fell over the prairie, the threat became all too real. Lily and Sam sat at her kitchen table, heads bent over a rough map of the town, when the first bullet shattered the window. Glass rained down, splintering across the floor. Sam yanked her to the ground, his voice rough with urgency as more shots thudded into the walls, sending plaster flying. Crawling across the floor, hearts pounding, they scrambled for the back door, ducking low as bullets tore through the night. Outside, Lily's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart hammering with the knowledge that death was only a few feet away. Sam's face was streaked with blood where a shard of glass had caught his cheek, but his eyes burned with fierce resolve. Together, they slipped into the barn, huddling among the horses as gunmen circled the property, shouting threats and firing wild shots into the darkness. Minutes stretched into hours before the attackers finally rode off, their voices fading with the sound of galloping hooves. When silence finally returned, Lily stood in the wreckage of her home, hands trembling. She looked at the shattered window, the bullet holes in the walls, the blood on Sam's face, and understood with absolute clarity just how dangerous the truth had become. Someone powerful was watching, someone willing to kill to keep the past buried. But that night, instead of retreating, Lily and Sam grew bolder. They patched up their wounds, boarded the windows, and made plans by candlelight. The town's cruelty no longer felt like random malice. It was a warning, a sign they were getting too close. Every attack, every threat only steeled Lily's resolve. Her grief had forged her into something new, harder, sharper, unwilling to break. And so, under the pale watch of the moon, Lily and Sam made a silent pact. They would not be driven out, no matter how many bullets tore through their walls. Every clue, every secret pried loose from Willow Creek's heart would be another nail in the coffin of those who believed themselves untouchable. For the first time, Lily felt the power of her own defiance. She would fight not just for justice, but for survival, and in that fight, she was no longer alone. With each day, the sense of siege around Lily's small ranch grew more suffocating. The attacks, though intermittent, had left scars on the walls and on her heart. But the danger only honed her determination, pushing her and Sam to dig deeper, work longer hours, and question everyone whose paths crossed the shadowy network that ran Willow Creek. The town grew quieter as they moved, as if holding its breath, afraid of what might surface. It was Sam who first noticed the pattern, the way the deputy, Charles, always seemed to know where Lily would be, the way he hovered around the edge of every conversation, ears straining for secrets. Charles had been her husband's closest friend, or so she'd thought. He had stood by the grave at the funeral, face drawn and eyes rimmed red, gripping her hand with what she'd believed was genuine sympathy. But now, as Lily replayed those moments, she saw them with new suspicion. Sam spent a long afternoon in the saloon, nursing a drink and listening as men whispered about shifting loyalties. He returned with news that Charles had recently come into money, new boots, a fancier gun, and rumors of visits to the sprawling estate of Mr. Grant, the wealthiest land baron in the valley. Grant was known for his ruthlessness, for swallowing up struggling ranches and rewarding those who served his interests. The town's rot, Lily realized, began and ended with men like him. Determined to get answers, Lily and Sam devised a risky plan. At dusk, they tracked Charles to the edge of Grant's property. From the safety of a stand of cottonwoods, they watched as Charles met with one of Grant's men, passing an envelope and receiving a heavy ledger in return. Lily's heart pounded with sick certainty. The betrayal was no longer just rumor. It was real, and it cut deeper than any wound. The next day, Lily cornered Charles in the alley behind the post office. The light slanted gold across the dust, painting everything with a false serenity. Sam watched from the shadows, shotgun close at hand. At first, Charles tried to bluster. "I don't know what you're talking about." But his eyes betrayed him, shifting to the side, sweat beading along his hairline. When Lily named Grant, Charles's composure shattered. Tears welled up in his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the truth tumbled out in a rush. He confessed to passing information about her husband's investigation, to hiding evidence, to accepting bribes under the threat of violence. Grant's men had threatened to ruin him, to hurt his family if he didn't cooperate. It was a familiar story in Willow Creek: power crushing decency, fear forcing good men to do unforgivable things. For a moment, Lily nearly crumpled beneath the weight of it. Charles had been part of her husband's life for years. They'd hunted together, celebrated holidays, trusted each other. The betrayal burned, and for a split second, Lily's resolve flickered. How many others had been bought or broken? How many more secrets hid behind friendly faces? Sam's steady presence pulled her back from despair. He put a hand on her shoulder, firm, reassuring, a reminder that their fight was not over. Charles, racked by guilt, pulled the ledger from inside his coat and offered it to Lily with shaking hands. The book was thick, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with names, numbers, and coded entries. Here were the bribes, the payoffs, the plans to take over every ranch that refused to bend to Grant's will, including her own. Lily took the ledger, her hands trembling as she realized what it meant. This was more than evidence. It was a map of the rot running through Willow Creek. The names inside were familiar: shopkeepers, lawmen, ranchers, men and women who had shaped her life since the day she'd arrived. The sense of betrayal deepened, but so too did her determination. She saw now how wide the conspiracy spread, how carefully each thread was woven to protect the powerful. As night fell, Lily and Sam returned to the ranch, locking the doors and checking the windows. The air felt charged, every sound outside making their nerves twitch. Together, they pored over the ledger by lamplight, reading every line, making notes, cross-referencing dates with nights her husband had come home late or worried. The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The sheriff was no mere bystander. He was orchestrating it all, using Charles and others as pawns. Exhaustion weighed heavy, but Lily's spirit would not break. She understood now that justice would not come easily, that exposing the truth would make her a bigger target than ever. Still, she would not stop. Her vow had become a living thing, fueled not only by love and loss, but by righteous anger at the system that had corrupted everything it touched. Charles left town that night, face ashen, haunted by what he'd done. Whether he would ever forgive himself, Lily didn't know. She only knew that she would never let fear or betrayal stop her now. She and Sam were in possession of the one thing the sheriff and Grant could not afford to lose: the truth, captured in ink and blood. With the ledger hidden and their strategy set, Lily and Sam braced for what would come next. The lines between friend and foe had blurred. and now every shadow in Willow Creek seemed to tremble with danger. But Lily's resolve had hardened to steel. She would see this through to the bitter end, no matter the cost. Night settled over Willow Creek like a heavy shroud, and Lily's ranch seemed to shrink under the weight of secrets she now carried. The ledger was a curse and a weapon, each page crackling with risk. It never left her side, not while she slept, not while she swept the porch or fed the horses. Sam, ever watchful, double-checked the windows and doors, his old soldier's instincts on high alert. They both knew the storm was coming. The ledger revealed more than bribes and backroom deals. Among the coded transactions and cryptic initials, Lily uncovered a pattern of land grabs orchestrated with chilling precision. Ranches seized under legal pretense, rivals ruined by false accusations, and accidents that suddenly looked like orchestrated murders. Her own ranch had been next in line, her husband's resistance marked in the margins with underlined threats. The conspiracy reached further than she'd imagined, its roots tangled deep in the sheriff's office and the land baron's estate. As she and Sam pieced together the puzzle, one truth became undeniable. The sheriff himself sat at the center of it all. His signature, his real one, not the crude copy stamped on public notices, appeared in coded form across the ledger. He wasn't just complicit. He was the spider at the heart of the web, orchestrating every betrayal, every threat, every act of violence that had left Willow Creek divided and afraid. Sam proposed a dangerous move. If they could find physical proof, letters, maps, or contracts, linking the sheriff directly to the land baron, they'd have enough to bring him down, maybe even to force the townsfolk to see the truth. The risk was monumental. Breaking into the sheriff's private office meant facing the law's full weight if caught. But there was no other path. The evidence in the ledger would mean nothing if the sheriff claimed it was a forgery, and the law in Willow Creek bent easily to the will of the powerful. So they waited for the darkest night. Clouds rolled in, cloaking the moon, and rain began to patter on the rooftops. An omen, Lily thought, or maybe a small blessing, washing away their footprints. They moved like ghosts through the back streets, Sam's battered revolver tucked beneath his coat. Lily's heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give them away. The sheriff's office sat near the center of town, the lamplight glowing sullen behind thick glass. The front doors were locked tight, but Sam knew another way. A narrow alley, a loose board behind the jailhouse. He pried it open with practiced ease, and together they slipped inside, hearts hammering in the dark. The air inside was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of ink and old leather. Sam led the way, every sense attuned, every step measured. They found the sheriff's private office at the end of a hallway lined with wanted posters and the fading smell of tobacco. Inside, the room was a shrine to arrogance. Trophies on the shelves, a desk piled with unopened letters, and a wall safe set into the boards behind a painting of the land baron's estate. Sam worked the safe with trembling hands, guided by an old trick he'd learned in the army. Lily kept watch at the door, ears straining for footsteps. The safe gave way with a click that seemed thunderous in the stillness. Inside, stacks of documents spilled out. Maps showing planned land divisions, letters in the sheriff's own hand, contracts signed in blood-red ink, and a list of names with accident written beside those already crossed out. Lily rifled through the papers, pulse quickening as she realized what she held. Proof of every murder, every theft, every deal struck behind closed doors. There were letters from the land baron promising payment for each ranch acquired, maps marking out which homesteads would fall next, and even her own name, circled with a date set beside it. Her husband's notes echoed in her mind, his warnings now clear as day. The sheriff had planned everything, including the killing that had made her a widow. A sudden noise, footsteps, heavy and close, sent fear spiking through her veins. Sam yanked her down behind the desk as two deputies entered the hallway. Lanterns bobbing, breath frozen, she watched the shadows pass, praying they wouldn't look too closely. The deputies paused outside the office, muttering about a storm and the sheriff's late-night meetings, before moving on. When the danger passed, Sam stuffed the evidence into a canvas sack, careful not to leave a trace. Their escape was a blur, a mad, silent dash through empty corridors, out the way they'd come, the rain covering their tracks as they vanished into the night. Back at the ranch, they pored over their spoils, adrenaline burning away their exhaustion. Every letter, every map built a case so damning even the sheriff would struggle to explain it away. Yet as dawn broke, Lily understood the scale of the battle ahead. The sheriff controlled the law, the deputies, and half the town's loyalty. The land baron controlled the money. With their evidence, she and Sam could bring down the monsters that haunted Willow Creek, but not without risking everything, maybe even their lives. But Lily's fear had long since turned to steel. No threat, no storm, no shadow of the past would stop her now. She would bring the truth to light, for her husband and for every soul in Willow Creek who had suffered in silence. The real villain was unmasked, and the final act of the war was about to begin. The morning after the break-in arrived, heavy with foreboding. The evidence Lily and Sam had gathered lay spread across the kitchen table. A damning mosaic of greed and murder that could topple powerful men, if only it could reach the right hands. But as dawn burned away the rain, a subtle unease threaded through the air. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings through broken window panes and under ill-fitting doors. Word traveled fast in Willow Creek, faster than either Lily or Sam anticipated. The townsfolk eyed Lily with a new wariness, their fear mingled with something like respect. Shopkeepers muttered to themselves, and children were herded indoors. The silence, once filled with judgment, now held anticipation, like a storm waiting to break. Sam suggested they lay low, at least for a day or two, but it was already too late. That afternoon, a letter arrived, sealed in red wax, the envelope smudged by hurried hands. Lily broke it open with trembling fingers. The note inside was short and brutal, the handwriting unfamiliar. Meet at Widow's Creek at sundown if you want the truth about your husband's killer. Come alone. Every instinct screamed caution, but the bait was too carefully chosen, too personal. Widow's Creek was where her husband had first proposed to her, the place where their story began, and it seemed where someone wanted it to end. Sam argued against going, but Lily could not ignore the chance. "If this is a trap," she said, her voice hard as flint, "I'll walk right through it, but I won't hide while someone else controls the story." The hours crawled by, thick with dread. They prepared as best they could. Sam cleaned his pistol and checked their horses, while Lily tucked the smallest piece of evidence into her boot, determined to bring back proof if nothing else. When the time came, she left Sam behind, against his protests, and set out alone for the creek, the sun bleeding red behind distant hills. The world shrank as she approached Widow's Creek. The willows hung low, shadows deepening as evening claimed the valley. The air felt thick, charged with danger. Lily slowed her horse, every muscle tense, every sense straining for movement. She saw nothing at first, just the black water, the silent trees, her own heart hammering in her ears. Then, out of the gloom, men stepped forward, faces half hidden, guns glinting in the fading light. Before Lily could react, two of them closed in behind, grabbing her arms and wrenching her from the saddle. She fought, teeth bared, but there were too many. The world spun, boots scuffed in the mud, and a rough cloth was yanked over her face. The smell of sweat and whiskey filled her nose, and her shouts were swallowed by the night. She was dragged, stumbling and half-blind, across uneven ground. The men moved with grim efficiency, wordless and cold. Finally, they threw her into the back of a wagon, the doors slamming shut, plunging her into darkness. The wagon lurched forward, wheels groaning as it rattled toward town. Meanwhile, Sam waited at the ranch, every second a torment. He paced the porch, rifle cradled in his arms, eyes fixed on the horizon. When the hour grew late and Lily did not return, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. He saddled his horse, heading first toward Widow's Creek, finding only a trail of hoofprints and a single glove, a silent sign left by Lily in the struggle. As Sam followed the tracks, men in the sheriff's employ watched from the shadows, waiting for him to draw near. The ambush was swift, a flash of movement, a crack of rifle fire, and Sam was knocked from his horse, a bullet grazing his side. Dazed and bleeding, he crawled for cover, firing back, refusing to fall quietly, but they overpowered him, clubbing him to the ground, binding his wrists with coarse rope. His vision faded as they dragged him off toward the land baron's barn, the last image a red sunset burning behind black hills. Lily, meanwhile, was brought not to the sheriff's office, but to the old jailhouse on the edge of town, its iron bars thick with rust and memory. The sheriff himself waited there, flanked by two deputies. He wore a smile thin as a knife, voice oily as he offered Lily a choice. Sign away your land, leave Willow Creek, and you'll live. Refuse, and you'll never see daylight again. Her only answer was silence, eyes burning with defiance. The sheriff locked the cell with a laugh, leaving her alone in the cold, stone darkness. Hours passed. Lily's mind ran circles in the small space, haunted by her husband's last words, by Sam's battered face, by the weight of every injustice she had witnessed. Despair threatened, but in the darkness her vow burned brighter than ever. She was not broken, not yet. She pressed her hand to her heart, remembering the promise she'd made by candlelight. Whatever it cost, she would not back down. Not for herself, not for Sam, and not for the man she loved and lost. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, signaling the beginning of the final reckoning. The night pressed in around Lily's cell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the shifting patterns of moonlight crawling through the bars. Every sound seemed magnified, the drip of water in the far corner, the distant thunder rolling across the plains, the clink of keys echoing down the stone corridor. She had lost track of time, but her resolve, if anything, only sharpened in the darkness. She remembered her husband's last words, her own promise, and the image of Sam's battered form. Even locked away, her spirit refused to bend. Footsteps approached, slow, hesitant, lighter than those of the men who had thrown her here. Through the iron bars appeared a young deputy, barely older than a boy, his face pale and nervous in the flickering lamplight. He stared at Lily with wide eyes, uncertainty etched in every line of his body. She saw his fear, but also something else. A crack in the armor of the sheriff's men, the possibility of conscience stirring beneath all the bluster and lies. Lily spoke not with anger, but with the weight of all she had lost, and all she still hoped to save. She told the deputy the truth. Of the murder, the ledger, the plans for the town, the sheriff's betrayal. She saw him tremble, saw his eyes flick to the floor as he remembered his own father losing their land to a rigged debt. For a long moment, it seemed the boy would bolt, but the fire in Lily's words took root. He slipped the key through the bars with shaking hands and vanished before she could thank him. Lily wasted no time. She crept through the sleeping jailhouse, boots soft against cold stone, heart hammering as she skirted past the desk where the night watchman dozed. In minutes, she was free, wind-whipped and shivering, but alive, her vow burning hotter than ever. She ran through alleys, hugging shadows, making for the edge of town where she and Sam had hidden their horses days earlier. At the old stable, she found her mare safe and waiting. Without saddle or bridle, she mounted up and rode fast into the dark, mud and gravel stinging her legs, the night alive with the threat of pursuit. She knew Sam would not have given up. Her instincts screamed that if he'd survived, he'd be somewhere near the land baron's estate, where so many of Willow Creek's secrets were buried. She reached the outskirts just as dawn began to split the sky. Smoke curled from the barn behind Grant's mansion, and armed men lounged near the doors, laughing over breakfast and cheap whiskey. Lily circled wide, dismounting near the hedgerow, crawling through wet grass and tangled weeds. Her breath fogged in the chilly air, nerves wound tight as piano wire. She watched, waited, and finally spotted Sam, slumped in the shadows, blood staining his shirt, wrists bound, but very much alive. She studied the men, counting their guns, the slow rhythm of their patrol. Timing her move between their jokes and their quarrels, Lily slipped into the barn through a loose board in the wall. The place stank of manure and fear, shafts of light slicing through the gloom. She found Sam conscious but weak, his face ghostly but his eyes blazing with stubborn life. She pressed a knife into his hands, quickly cutting the ropes, whispering her plan. Sam, even wounded, managed a thin smile, a flash of pride that sent fresh strength through her limbs. Getting out would be harder. The guards grew suspicious, one stumbling toward the barn, gun drawn. Lily moved first, springing from the shadows to catch him off guard. The struggle was short, but brutal, ending with the guard unconscious, Sam armed, and Lily's knuckles raw and bleeding. The gunfire brought more men, but the barn was a maze, filled with hiding places and heavy tools. Lily fought with the desperation of someone who'd already lost everything, swinging a pitchfork, dodging blows, never letting her fear slow her down. Sam covered her as best he could, firing wild shots, keeping their attackers guessing. The commotion drew the townsfolk's eyes. By the time Lily and Sam staggered into the yard, bloody but defiant, the sun was high and people had begun to gather. The courage in Lily's actions, the audacity of a woman refusing to die quietly, inspired whispers that grew into questions. Why had the sheriff locked her away? What really happened to her husband? What secrets had the land baron paid so much to bury? Lily and Sam didn't run. Instead, they limped to the center of the road, clutching their sack of evidence and the battered ledger, daring the town to see the truth. The land baron's men hesitated, uncertain, while the townsfolk inched closer, drawn by something stronger than fear. For the first time since the shooting, Lily saw hope flicker in familiar faces, men and women who, for years, had looked the other way, but now, just maybe, were ready to listen. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had shifted. Courage, once a lonely burden, now spread through the crowd like wildfire. The final reckoning was coming, and for the first time, Lily felt she would not be standing alone. By midday, the tension in Willow Creek had reached its breaking point. Word of Lily's escape from the jailhouse and the battered, bloodied Sam by her side had swept through the town like prairie fire. People spilled from shops and homes, curiosity and fear warring in their faces. In the shadow of the saloon, the land baron's men gathered, hands hovering over their holsters, eyes searching for the first sign of trouble. On the far side of the street, deputies assembled outside the sheriff's office, rifles at the ready, their allegiance plain for all to see. But the mood in the town had shifted. Where once suspicion and silence reigned, now there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. The evidence Lily and Sam carried, the ledger, the letters, the maps, and the names, was no longer just their weapon. It had become the town's last hope for truth. People whispered to each other, remembered old wrongs and lost land, faces hardening with each retold grievance. The collective pain of Willow Creek, buried for so long beneath fear, finally began to crack the mask of resignation. Lily stood in the center of Main Street, shoulders squared against the world, the ledger clutched tight in her arms. Sam limped beside her, blood seeping through his bandages, but eyes fierce and determined. The townsfolk gathered in a wide circle, giving the pair space yet leaning forward, drawn by the gravity of the moment. The sheriff emerged from his office with the land baron at his side. Both men dressed in their Sunday best, jackets buttoned, boots polished, hats pulled low. But there was no hiding the pallor in the sheriff's face or the nervous tick in the baron's jaw. Their power, once absolute, seemed suddenly fragile under the midday sun. Lily didn't need a speech. The evidence spoke for itself. She stepped forward, voice clear and unwavering, and laid out the truth. She listed every name in the ledger, every bribe, every false arrest, every death disguised as an accident. She described the map of stolen ranches, the contracts signed in secret, the letters linking the land baron and the sheriff in a conspiracy of greed and blood. At first, the sheriff tried to shout her down, voice echoing off clapboard walls. But Lily pressed on, meeting his bluster with facts, raising the ledger for all to see. Sam added the details only a witness could provide. The threats, the beatings, the whispered warnings that had dogged the town for years. The townsfolk grew restless, eyes darting from Lily to the sheriff and back again, anger simmering in the growing heat. Desperation broke the sheriff's composure. He reached for his pistol, motioning for his deputies to close in. For a split second, time seemed to freeze, the sun glaring down, dust swirling, the sharp intake of breath from the crowd. Then, chaos erupted. The sheriff fired first, the crack of the gun splitting the hush. The bullet missed Lily by inches, tearing a groove in the wooden post behind her. Sam shoved her aside, returning fire with shaky hands. Deputies rushed forward, but something unexpected happened. The youngest deputy, the same one who had freed Lily, turned his weapon on the sheriff, blocking his path, eyes blazing with defiance. "No more lies!" he shouted, voice shaking. A struggle broke out, men grappling in the street. The land baron tried to slip away, but a group of ranchers closed ranks, blocking his escape. The townsfolk surged forward, shouting for justice, no longer willing to let power dictate truth. The sheriff, cornered and desperate, tried to fight his way free, But it was the deputy's shot that finally brought him down. A single, clean bullet that dropped the lawman where he stood. Silence settled, heavy and stunned. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the spell broke. Townsfolk rushed to restrain the remaining deputies, to pull the land baron from his horse, to check on Lily and Sam. The ledger was passed from hand to hand, examined with wide eyes and shaking fingers. There was anger, yes, but also relief, a sense that a long nightmare was finally ending. Lily stumbled to her husband's grave as the sun began to set, the events of the day pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. Sam followed, limping, and together they stood in the stillness, battered but unbroken. She knelt, laying a hand on the headstone, letting the tears she'd held back for weeks finally fall. She spoke not in words but in memories, of laughter, of dreams shared, of promises made and kept. The wind carried her grief away, leaving only gratitude and fierce pride in its wake. The sheriff's body was carried away, his power gone with him. The land baron, stripped of allies, surrendered to the will of the people. Willow Creek, for the first time in years, belonged to its citizens again. As darkness fell and the stars kindled above the plains, Lily felt the weight of her vow settle into something softer. Her fight was nearly over. Justice, long denied, had come home at last, not in violence alone, but in the courage of a widow who would not be silenced, and the townsfolk who finally found their voices. The dawn that followed the showdown arrived soft and golden, spreading light across a town forever changed. Willow Creek felt different, as if a great storm had finally passed and left the air scrubbed clean. Gone was the ever-present tension that once shadowed each street and alleyway. Gone were the whispered threats and fearful glances that had ruled the townsfolk for so long. In their place was something fragile but unmistakable, a sense of possibility, a beginning where once there was only fear. Lily awoke on her ranch to the sound of birdsong, sunlight spilling through windows still cracked from gunfire. She moved slowly, every muscle aching from days of struggle, but her heart was lighter than it had been in months. She wandered outside to greet the day, passing by Sam, who sat on the porch steps with a battered mug of coffee, his face bruised but his eyes bright with tired satisfaction. The land, once a place of sorrow and siege, felt alive beneath her boots. The horses grazed peacefully in the fields. The house, though battered, stood strong. The town gathered later that morning. There was no grand assembly, just neighbors coming together, drawn by the gravity of what they'd endured and what they must now rebuild. The bodies of the sheriff and his loyalists were already buried in the earth they had so long sought to control. The land baron, stripped of his power and wealth, stood alone before the people he had oppressed. Justice would not be quick, nor would it be vengeful. The townsfolk, led by voices that once trembled in fear, laid out the evidence and chose a path of fairness. The baron would face a court of his peers, and the ranches he had stolen would be returned to their rightful owners. Piece by piece. Lily played her part quietly. She handed over the ledger, the contracts, the maps, everything she and Sam had risked their lives to recover. She asked for nothing in return, only that the memory of her husband and the others who had died be honored in the years to come. There were moments when grief swept over her, sudden and sharp, but there was comfort too in the way the town now looked at her. Not with pity or suspicion, but with respect, even gratitude. Sam chose to stay. The war, he said, was finally over, and he was tired of running from ghosts. He helped Lily repair the ranch, mending fences, patching windows, teaching the children of Willow Creek how to ride and care for the land. He found a place for himself, not as a wanderer or a hired gun, but as a friend and neighbor, someone who had finally come home. Slowly, the town began to heal. Fields that had been left fallow were tilled and planted again. Families that had fled returned to reclaim what was theirs. New friendships formed, forged in fire and hardship, and old wounds were tended by shared labor and laughter. There were rough days still, storms that threatened crops, tempers that flared as boundaries were redrawn, but hope, once so rare, was now a part of daily life. Lily found peace in the quiet hours of the morning and in the steady rhythm of ranch work. She still spoke to her husband sometimes, her words drifting into the wind as she walked the fields they dreamed of tending together. She knew that sorrow would never leave her completely, but it no longer ruled her days. She had become something more than a widow, more than the woman left behind by violence and betrayal. She was a survivor, a leader, a symbol of what could be reclaimed when one person refused to surrender. One evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills, Lily walked to the small cemetery at the edge of her land. She knelt by her husband's grave, the grass soft beneath her knees, the headstone warm from the day's last light. The town's children played in the distance, their laughter carried by the breeze. She spoke softly, promising to live boldly and well, to honor the love and courage that had brought her through the darkest nights. The pain had not vanished, but it was softened by gratitude for Sam's steadfast friendship, for the strength she had found in herself, for the hope that now filled Willow Creek. She stood, brushing dust from her dress, and turned toward home, the sky painted in hues of orange and lavender. As night settled over the plains, the ranch lights glowed against the darkness. Lily watched from the porch as Sam finished his evening chores, the steady clink of buckets and low murmur of horses, a lullaby of peace restored. She felt the story of her loss and her victory settle around her shoulders like a shawl, heavy but comforting and wholly her own. Willow Creek had a long road ahead, but its people walked it together now, no longer ruled by fear or by the whim of cruel men. The land was theirs again, and the promise of tomorrow shimmered in every field, every sunrise, every shared meal around a battered but unbroken table. For Lily, each day was both remembrance and renewal, a chance to honor what was lost by living fully and bravely. She had kept her vow, and in doing so, had helped bring about a new dawn. As the stars blinked to life above the open prairie, she whispered her final promise to the man she loved. "I will carry you with me, always, and I will never let this place slip back into darkness, not while I draw breath." And so, with hope rising and courage unbroken, Lily and the people of Willow Creek stepped forward into a future shaped by the power of one woman's resolve, and the faith that, even after the longest night, the sun would rise again.